The black leather wallet disappeared somewhere between the coffee shop on Fifth and the parking garage on Monroe. Swallowed whole by the indifferent belly of a city that had never once paused for anyone. Inside, it was $40,000 in cash funds she had withdrawn for a private real estate transaction that could not go through any traceable wire, and beside the money sat documents that no bank, no lawyer, no government office could simply reissue. A signed letter of intent from a business partner who had since died, a handwritten note from her late mother tucked behind an expired library card, and the only physical copy of a legal agreement that had taken 11 months to negotiate. The woman who owned it, Diana Mercer, stood in the marble-floored entrance of her penthouse apartment on the 42nd floor and turned every pocket of her coat inside out with the methodical calm of someone who had trained herself never to panic in public, even when panic was the only reasonable response. She was 43 years old, the founder and chief executive of Mercer Capital Advisors, a woman whose name appeared regularly in the financial press, beside words like visionary and formidable and occasionally ruthless, and she had not cried in front of another person since the year her mother passed, 6 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and wilting carnations. She did not cry now. She simply stood in the silence of her apartment and felt something collapse quietly inside her chest, like a wall that had been load-bearing for a very long time, finally giving way without a sound. She retraced everything. She called the coffee shop, where a teenager with a nose ring told her nothing had been turned in. She called the parking garage and was placed on hold for 9 minutes before a recorded message informed her that the office was closed. She called 2 of her assistants, who began making their own calls immediately, their voices brisk and efficient over the phone. Because that was what she paid them to be. She filed a report with the police department, speaking to a detective named Harris, who listened with professional patience and then told her, with the kind of gentleness reserved for delivering bad news to people who were accustomed to solutions, that cash recovery in situations like this was unlikely. Most people who found a wallet containing that kind of money, he said carefully, did not bring it back. She thanked him and hung up and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her living room, looking out at the city below. All those lit windows and moving headlights, all those strangers going about their evenings with no knowledge whatsoever of what she had lost. At some point after midnight, she sat down on the edge of her bed, still dressed in her work clothes, and told herself with quiet resolution that the money could be replaced. The documents were harder. The note from her mother was impossible. She closed her eyes and did not sleep so much as drift, her mind cycling through the events of the afternoon like a film she kept rewinding, searching for the frame where everything had gone wrong. The doorbell rang at 7:48 the following morning. Diana was already awake, already dressed, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee she had poured 20 minutes ago and not yet touched. She set the cup down and walked to the door, and when she opened it, she found a man she had never seen before standing in the hallway with her wallet in his hand. He was perhaps 45, lean in the way of someone who worked with his body, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been lived in long enough to show the lines of both laughter and difficulty. He wore a clean but faded flannel shirt, work boots that had been polished recently but were old enough that no amount of polish would fully disguise their age, and jeans with a small tear at the left knee that had been mended with careful, even stitches in a slightly darker thread. He held the wallet out toward her with both hands, the way you might offer something back to a person you respected, and he said, quietly, that he believed this belonged to her. Diana took it from him without speaking, and for a moment she simply stood there, holding it, feeling the familiar weight of it, the particular texture of the leather, and something moved through her that she could not immediately name. She opened it. Every bill was there, arranged in the same order she kept them, largest denominations at the back. The documents were there, the letter of intent, the legal agreement, and behind the expired library card, her mother's note, still folded along its original creases, the paper slightly softened with age but intact and untouched. She looked up at the man. She asked him if he had counted the money. He said he had not needed to. She asked him where he had found it, and he told her it had slipped from her coat pocket at the coffee shop on Fifth, that he had been sitting at the table beside hers when she stood to leave, that he had seen it fall, but by the time he reached the street, she was gone. He had looked through the wallet only far enough to find her address on a piece of mail that had been tucked into the side pocket, and then he had driven across the city that evening to return it, but the doorman had told him she was not in, and so he had come back this morning. Diana asked him how much she owed him, and she meant the question seriously. In the practical way she meant most questions, because in her experience, there was a price for everything, and the only honest transaction was one where both parties acknowledged it openly. She named a figure generous, she thought, appropriately generous, and the man shook his head with a small, unhurried movement that was neither embarrassed nor offended. He said simply that he did not want a reward. He said it was not his money. He said he hoped the rest of her day would be better than her previous one had been, and then he turned and walked back toward the elevator with an easy, unhurried stride. And the doors closed behind him, and he was gone. Diana stood in her doorway for a long moment after the elevator light blinked out. In the years she had spent building her company, she had developed a precise and somewhat unsentimental understanding of human motivation, not because she was cynical by nature, but because clarity, she believed, was a form of respect. She knew what people wanted, and she knew the gap between what they said they wanted and what they actually wanted, and she had learned to work within that gap with both skill and honesty. But this man had disrupted something in that understanding, and she found herself unable to fit him neatly into any category she kept. A piece of mail, folded in her side pocket. She went back inside and searched the wallet more carefully, and found it a small envelope from her building's management office, addressed to her. She looked at the return address on the envelope he must have used to find her, and then she turned it over and looked at the postmark. And then she stood very still for a moment, and then she sat down and drank her cold coffee, and thought about a man who had held $40,000 in his hands and had driven across a city twice to give it back to a stranger. She told herself she only wanted to thank him properly. That was the story she offered herself for the first 2 days after his visit, during which she found herself distracted at meetings in a way she was not accustomed to, her attention drifting from balance sheets and acquisition proposals to the image of a man in a faded flannel shirt, holding a wallet with both hands. She had her assistant, a meticulous young woman named Claire, run a quiet search on the address. She had found a street in the Eastfield neighborhood, which was not a part of the city Diana had any professional reason to visit, and what Claire returned was sparse. A name, Marcus Webb, and a few public records that painted the barest outline of a life. There was no business registration in his name. No professional profile online, no press mentions, no court filings, nothing that would explain why a man in his mid-40s, apparently living in a working-class neighborhood, would be carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had made a decision long ago about who he wanted to be and had simply been living it out ever since. On the third morning, before she could talk herself out of it, Diana got into her car and drove to Eastfield. The neighborhood was the kind of place the city's development plans had not yet reached, which meant it was also the kind of place the city's impersonal erosions had not yet fully flattened. The buildings were old but not abandoned, the streets narrow and tree-lined, the small front gardens tended with the particular pride of people who did not have much but took care of what they had. She found the address easily, a 2-story apartment building with a brick facade that had been painted over in a pale yellow that was chipping at the edges, with a small parking area at the side where 2 older cars sat beside a third that was up on a jack, its hood raised. Marcus Webb was crouched beside the open wheel well of the jacked-up car, with a wrench in his hand, wearing a gray t-shirt and the same work boots she remembered, his back to the street. Diana pulled her car to the curb half a block away and sat for a moment, feeling the mild absurdity of her position, a 43-year-old business executive sitting in a $70,000 sedan, watching a stranger fix a car, and then feeling something else beneath that, something she recognized after a moment as genuine curiosity, the kind she had not felt about a person in a long time. She watched him work. He was thorough and unhurried, moving around the car with the easy confidence of someone who had done this many times, not performing the labor but simply doing it. At one point, a small girl of perhaps 6 or 7 came barreling out of the building's front door and ran toward him. And he looked up and smiled a full, unguarded smile The kind that takes over a person's whole face, and she said something Diana could not hear, and he said something back, and the girl ran back inside, apparently satisfied. A woman in her 80s appeared in the doorway of the ground floor unit and called something toward Marcus, and he waved and called back, and she disappeared again. He finished with the car, lowered it off the jack, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked across the small parking area to the dumpster to deposit an old filter. It was only when he turned back that he noticed Diana's car at the curb. And then, because she had not thought through what she intended to do once she was here, she got out of the car and walked toward him. He recognized her immediately. He did not seem surprised exactly, but something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not suspicion, something more like the quiet adjustment of a person who is genuinely comfortable in the world and simply updates his picture of it when new information arrives. She told him she had not been able to leave things the way they were. She told him she had wanted to thank him properly, and that she was sorry to show up unannounced, and that she realized this was unusual. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said that nothing about the last several days had been particularly usual, and that she was welcome to come in if she wanted a cup of coffee. She said yes before she had fully decided to. His apartment was small, clean, and arranged with the kind of order that spoke of intention rather than compulsion. There were books on wooden shelves that had been built into the wall. Not decorative books arranged by color, but actual books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, many of them clearly read multiple times. On the kitchen counter there was a child's drawing held to the refrigerator by a single magnet, a house with a sun above it, and two figures of different heights standing in front, labeled in the careful large letters of a young child, Daddy and me. She looked at it for a moment longer than she intended to. He made coffee in a French press, and they sat at his kitchen table, and she thanked him again. And this time the thanks carried something different in it, something that had been building for 3 days, and was no longer simply about the wallet. He accepted it simply, without deflecting, which she found unexpectedly difficult to receive. Most people, when thanked sincerely, either minimized the thing they had done or accepted the praise in a way that asked for more. He did neither. He just said she was welcome, and meant it, and moved on. She began coming to Eastfield without telling anyone, not even Claire, who managed Diana's calendar with the precision of an air traffic controller and would have had questions. She told herself she was simply in the neighborhood, which was untrue, and which she did not examine too closely. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, she witnessed a version of a life that seemed to operate on principles she had not encountered outside of books. She saw Marcus carry a week's worth of groceries up 3 flights of stairs for an elderly man named Philip, who had bad knees and lived alone on the top floor, and then stay for an hour, while Philip told him stories Diana could not hear through the window, but that made Marcus laugh with genuine pleasure. She saw him spend an entire Saturday afternoon repairing the fence of a woman named Ruth, who had a vegetable garden she protected, with the fierce tenderness of someone whose garden was one of the things that still made life feel like a divine gift. She saw him reading in the parking area one evening, sitting on the hood of his car with a worn paperback, completely still, as if the city around him were not there, as if stillness were not something you had to achieve, but something you simply chose. She asked a woman at the corner store about him one afternoon, mentioning his name in what she hoped was a casual way. The woman, who wore her white hair in 2 neat braids and was buying a single onion and a lottery ticket, put the onion down on the counter and looked at Diana with the direct assessment of someone who had been watching people for a very long time and did not waste time on indirection. She said Marcus Webb was the best neighbor this street had ever had. She said he had lived there for 3 years, and in those 3 years, she had never once heard him raise his voice, never once seen him turn away from someone who needed something, never once heard him speak badly of anyone, which, she said, was something she could not say about most people she knew. Then she picked her onion back up and added, almost as an afterthought, that it was a shame what had happened to him, because he used to have a lot more, and it had not made him any different than he was now. Diana paid for her own groceries, and drove home, and sat with that last sentence for a long time. What she found when she looked further was not a mystery so much as an archaeology layers of a life that had to be uncovered carefully and in order. Marcus Webb had founded a construction and design firm called Web Structural, in his early 30s, growing it over nearly a decade from a two-man operation into a regional company with over 90 employees, a solid reputation for quality, and contracts with several mid-size municipalities. The company had been worth, at its peak, something in the range of $8 million. Not a fortune by the standards of Diana's world, but a substantial achievement, built year by year through the kind of disciplined, attentive work that turned clients into advocates. He had had a partner in the company for the last 4 years of its operation, a man named Gerald Harmon, who had handled the financial and administrative side of the business, while Marcus managed operations and client relationships. The arrangement had seemed, for a time, to work well. And then it had not. The public records told one part of the story. A civil suit, filed, and then withdrawn. A company that had dissolved rather than been acquired. A sudden and total absence where Web Structural had once been. The fuller story she assembled gradually, from court filings, from old business news archives, and from a conversation she had eventually, carefully, with a retired contractor named Dale, who had worked for Marcus for 7 years, and who agreed to meet her for lunch at a diner in Eastfield, and who, over a bowl of soup and a cup of coffee, told her what he knew with the slow, deliberate weight of someone recounting something that had cost him to witness. Gerald Harmon had been systematically diverting funds from Web Structural for at least 2 years before it came to light, inflating vendor invoices, creating fictitious subcontractor payments, routing the overages into accounts that no audit had initially caught because the accounts themselves were structured to appear legitimate. By the time the scheme was discovered, more than $1.2 million had been removed from the company, a figure that, combined with the debt load Marcus had taken on to fund an expansion that Gerald had encouraged, and that now served only to increase the total damage, left Web Structural not merely insolvent but unrecoverable. Marcus had filed the civil suit and then withdrawn it. And when Dale asked him why, Marcus had said, quietly, that the legal process would take 3 to 5 years, that it would consume everything he had left, and that he had a daughter to raise. He had walked away from the wreckage of his company, settled what debts he could, and moved to Eastfield with his daughter, whose name was Lily, and whose drawing was on his refrigerator with a single magnet. Diana sat with this information for 3 days before she did anything with it. Not because she was uncertain what it meant, but because she was uncertain what it meant for her, which was a different question, and one she needed to answer with the same honesty she would apply to any significant decision. She had built her career on the belief that fairness was not sentimental, that it was structural, that it had to be built into systems deliberately, or it would be engineered out of them just as deliberately. What she had found in the story of Marcus Webb was not an abstraction about fairness. It was a specific man who had lost a specific thing because of the calculated dishonesty of a specific person. And that person, as it turned out, was not a stranger to her. Gerald Harmon. She had known the name for months before she connected it to Marcus, had known it in the context of her own company's dealings, because Gerald Harmon was the principal of Harmon Venture Partners, a mid-market investment firm that had been brought in as a financial advisor on a significant infrastructure project that Mercer Capital was co-financing. She had never had a direct relationship with Harmon. The engagement had been managed at a level below her. But when she pulled the files and read through the documentation herself, for the first time, she felt the particular chill of something recognized too late. There were patterns in the Harmon Venture billing records that she knew how to read. Structures that, to someone who was not looking for them, would appear ordinary. To someone who was, they looked like something she had seen before, in a slightly different form. In the court filings she had read about Web Structural, she did not go to Marcus first. She went to the files. She went through 3 years of Harmon Ventures' work with Mercer Capital, and she found what she was almost certain she would find before she finished, which was evidence that Gerald Harmon had been running the same scheme, or a variation of it, not only against Marcus Webb, but against at least 2 other companies in the years since, extracting money through the same infrastructure of false documentation and obscured accounts, adapted each time to the particular vulnerabilities of whoever he was working with. The scale was larger now. He had refined the approach, and because he was sophisticated, and because the people he worked with were busy and trusted their processes, no one had looked closely enough in time. The choice she faced was not, if she was honest with herself, actually a difficult one, even though it felt like one because of its complexity. What made it feel difficult was not the ethics, which were clear, but the cost, which was real. Terminating Mercer Capital's relationship with Harmon Venture Partners in the middle of the infrastructure project would create disruption and expense. Pursuing a formal investigation would take time and resources and would require her to explain to her board why the engagement had not been more carefully vetted from the start. There was a version of this situation in which the easiest path was also the quieter one, in which she flagged her concerns to Harmon directly, accepted his denials with the plausible grace of someone who had raised the issue and moved on, and continued to the end of the project without further trouble. She sat with that version long enough to understand it fully, and then she set it aside and called her attorney. The investigation she commissioned was thorough and, by design, discreet. She brought in a forensic accounting firm whose work she trusted, and she asked them to begin with the Harmon Venture billing records before broadening to Harmon's full history of client engagements over the past 8 years. What came back over the following 3 weeks was more comprehensive than even she had expected. A pattern of fraud that spanned 7 client relationships, 5 of which had resulted in serious financial harm to the clients, 2 of which had resulted in business failures. Marcus Webb's company was one of the 7. Diana's company was the most recent. The total estimated loss across all affected parties ran to somewhere in the range of $9 million, spread across years and entities in a way that had made each individual loss look like bad luck or poor management, rather than what it actually was. She had not told Marcus any of this. She had continued to visit Eastfield less covertly now, making no real attempt to disguise the fact of her presence, and she and Marcus had fallen into something that neither of them had named, but that felt, from the inside, like a friendship that was still becoming whatever it was going to be. They had coffee at his kitchen table, sometimes with Lily present, who was 7, and had very strong opinions about which books were worth reading and which were not, and who had decided, with the frank authority of a child who has spent a great deal of time in the company of a thoughtful adult, that Diana was acceptable, and also that Diana needed to read the second book in a particular series about a girl who discovers her grandmother was a lighthouse keeper. Before she read the third book, regardless of what order the library had them shelved in, Diana had bought both books on the way home. They walked in the park at the end of the street on Sunday mornings, talking about work, about cities, about the difference between the life you plan and the one you actually live. Marcus talked about his work the way people talk about things they genuinely love, not with the evangelical fervor of someone trying to convince you of something, but with the easy warmth of someone describing a country they know well and are happy to have come from. He talked about the way buildings failed, which was always slower than people thought and almost always preventable, and about the particular satisfaction of looking at a structure that had stood for 60 years and understanding the decisions that had made it last. The foresight built into the joints and the foundations by people who had known they would never see the full span of what they were making. Diana listened to this and thought about the decisions she made every day in the service of returns that were measured in quarters. And she did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had forgotten, somewhere in the years of building her company, what it felt like to build something for longevity rather than exit. She had told him she was looking into something connected to his former partner, framing it carefully, watching his face as she said it. He had gone quiet for a moment, and then said that he hoped she was not doing anything on his account, because it was not worth the trouble. And she had said that she was doing it on account of the truth, which was different, and he had looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something layered in it, something that was not gratitude exactly but was in the same territory. When Gerald Harmon discovered there was an investigation, it took him 11 days, which told Diana something about how carefully he monitored his exposure. She received the first message through an intermediary, framed as a friendly caution, a suggestion that certain inquiries might be disruptive to ongoing business relationships, accompanied by a reminder of the financial implications of project disruption at a late stage. She read it and forwarded it to her attorney. The second approach was less friendly, a call to two members of her board, in which Harmon characterized her investigation as the result of a personal conflict of interest, implying that her judgment had been compromised by a private relationship. This was more sophisticated, because it was harder to dismiss than a threat, and because it required her to address the board directly and honestly about her involvement with Marcus, which she did, in a meeting that was the most uncomfortable she had sat through in several years. Because it required her to speak, not in the language of analysis and strategy, but in the language of what she actually believed and why. She told the board that she had found evidence of systematic fraud affecting their company and several others, that the documentation was conclusive, and that her personal acquaintance with one of the prior victims was not the reason she had investigated but was, in a narrow and specific sense, the reason she had looked at the right thing at the right time. She said that she understood if they felt this required a recusal on her part, and then she sat quietly and let them decide. They did not ask her to recuse. They asked her to continue. Two of the board members, she learned later, had already independently noticed anomalies in the Harmon billing records and had been waiting, without quite knowing they were waiting, for someone to take the thing seriously. Marcus found out about all of it on a Thursday evening in October, when Diana came to Eastfield and sat down at his kitchen table and told him. Lily was at a neighbor's for dinner, and the apartment was quiet except for the sound of the street below. And she told him the whole thing in the order it had happened, because she believed he was owed the truth in its full shape, rather than in the simplified version she could have given him, that would have been easier for both of them to sit with. He listened without interrupting, his hands around his coffee cup. And when she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, quietly, that he wished she had told him sooner. She said she had needed to be certain first. He said he understood that. He said he was not angry, which she believed, because she had come to understand that Marcus did not store anger the way most people did not collect it and carry it forward, but processed it and released it and moved on, not because he was passive but because he had decided, at some point in the wreckage of his former life, that the only person whose character he was ultimately responsible for was his own. Then he said, with a directness she had come to expect from him, that he was worried about her, and that he wanted her to be careful, and that Gerald Harmon was a person who had shown, over many years and many situations, that he was willing to damage people to protect himself. She said she knew that. He said he was asking her to stop, not because the cause was not just, but because he did not want her to get hurt. She looked at him across the small kitchen table. In the quiet apartment, with the October light coming through the window and his daughter's drawing on the refrigerator, and she said she was not going to stop. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded. Once. Slowly. The way you nod when you know an argument is over, and the person was right. The meeting at which the evidence was formally presented took place in a conference room on the 31st floor of Mercer Capital's building, on a cold November morning when the city outside was gray and sharp-edged, and the coffee was very strong. Present were Diana, her attorney, and the forensic accounting team, two representatives of the other affected companies who had been brought in after they were identified, Gerald Harmon and his legal counsel, and a representative of the Financial Regulatory Authority who had been notified through proper channels 10 days prior. Diana had prepared for many outcomes and had decided, in the preparation, that the one she wanted most was not dramatic resolution, but accurate record, that what mattered most was that the full picture exists somewhere in verifiable form, regardless of what anyone chose to do with it. She presented the evidence methodically, in the order it had been gathered, without editorializing, and without the prosecutorial heat that the situation might have invited. The forensic accountants presented their analysis. The documentation spoke for itself, because it had been designed, once, to be hidden, and was now in a context where it could not be. Gerald Harmon's attorney spent 40 minutes asking questions whose real purpose was delay, which is a recognizable and not particularly effective tactic in the presence of people who have already read everything. When the meeting ended, Gerald Harmon left the room without speaking to anyone, and Diana sat in the quiet of the empty conference room for a few minutes, after everyone else had gone, looking out at the gray city, feeling something settle, The legal process that followed took the better part of 6 months, which was faster than these things usually moved, partly because the documentation was unusually complete, and partly because 2 of Gerald Harmon's former associates, faced with the evidence Diana's team had compiled, and the uncomfortable prospect of being the last ones holding the liability, chose cooperation over loyalty, with a speed that suggested loyalty had never been particularly deep to begin with. The formal findings substantiated the full scope of the fraud across all 7 client relationships. Gerald Harmon reached a settlement that required, among other things, restitution to the affected parties, a process that was imperfect, as restitution processes always are, because money returned years later cannot fully account for the opportunities missed, the confidence eroded, and the plain human cost of years spent believing the failure was yours when it was not. But it was, at minimum, a formal and public acknowledgement of what had been done and to whom. Marcus received a restitution payment that, while it did not restore everything he had built and lost the years, the team, the particular pride of a company that carried your name, gave him a foundation he had not had before, and a legal record that said the right things about the right people. More important to him than the money, as he told Diana over coffee one quiet afternoon in his kitchen, while Lily drew at the table beside them, was the existence of a record, a document in a regulatory file somewhere that said, in the dry language of official proceedings, that Webb Structural had been a sound company that had been deliberately destroyed, that Marcus Webb had not failed but had been failed, and that the failure had a name and a cause and was not his to carry. His reputation, which had not been so much damaged as quietly erased by the dissolution of his company, began to recover in ways that were modest at first, and then, as word moved through the professional community the way word does when the story is both true and corrective, became more substantial. Former clients reached out. A contractor who had worked with him years earlier and had always believed in his quality called to propose a project. A small municipal authority that had heard the story through channels these things always travel, even when you do not intend them to, inquired about his availability for a facilities assessment. A woman who had been one of Webb Structural's earliest clients, a property developer named Sandra Cho, who had given him his second major contract when he was still running the company out of a rented office above a dry cleaner, called to say that she had always wondered what had happened, and that she was glad to know the truth, and that she hoped he was doing well. And they had a conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours, and ended with a tentative agreement to meet for lunch and discuss a project she had been thinking about for several years, but had not yet found the right person to trust with. None of this arrived with fanfare. It arrived the way good things tend to arrive for people who are not performing their life for an audience, quietly, in the form of one opportunity and then another, accumulating in the patient way of things that are built rather than staged. He did not change. That was the thing Diana noticed most clearly. As the months passed, the thing she found herself returning to when she tried to understand what exactly it was about this man that had altered something in her own thinking. He received the restitution and the returning professional respect and the new opportunities with the same equanimity with which he had, for 3 years, carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs for an old man with bad knees. He still fixed his neighbors' cars on Saturday mornings. He still sat on the hood of his own car sometimes in the evenings with a worn paperback. He still listened, when people talked to him, with the full, unhurried attention of someone to whom listening was not a social performance but a genuine practice. He did not become more confident, or more expansive, or more anything as his circumstances improved. He was simply, continuously, himself, which was, Diana had come to understand, one of the rarest things a person could be. She had changed. She was less certain of this, or rather she was certain of it but uncertain of its full dimensions, in the way you are when you are inside a change rather than looking back at it from a distance. What she noticed first was small things. That she had begun to say no to meetings that had no real purpose more easily, and without guilt. That she had started buying lunch for Philip, Marcus's upstairs neighbor, whenever she was in the neighborhood, not as a gesture but as a habit, the way you form habits around things that feel right. That she had called her cousin, whom she had not spoken to in 2 years over a disagreement she could no longer fully reconstruct, and had simply apologized, without explaining or negotiating the terms of the apology. She had also, for the first time in longer than she could remember, taken an entire Saturday off, not to recover from the week before, not to prepare for the week ahead, but simply to sit in a park and read, and to notice, with something close to wonder, that the city she had lived in for 17 years had parks she had never been to, and light at a certain late afternoon angle that turned the water in the fountain, a particular shade of gold that she had never seen because she had never been somewhere without an agenda long enough to see it. What she noticed second, and more slowly, was that the loneliness she had carried for years, not the occasional loneliness of a busy person who wished for more time with friends, but the structural loneliness of someone who had built a life that left little room for the things that make a life feel inhabited, had begun to ease, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a room becomes lighter when someone opens a window that has been painted shut for a long time. Marcus told her one Sunday morning in the park, as November settled into the kind of cold that makes bare trees look deliberate, and the sky a particular shade of pale blue that belongs only to late autumn, that he was thinking of leaving the city. Not permanently, he said he still wanted to be close to the school, to Lily's friends, to the neighborhood he had come to belong to. But there was a project he had been offered in a smaller city, 3 hours north, a restoration of a historic civic building that would take 8 or 9 months, and that would give him a chance to do the kind of work he had always loved, most careful, structural, aimed at making something last. He said it thoughtfully, the way he said most things, with the slightly forward lean of someone who is sharing something real rather than performing a disclosure. Diana listened, and she recognized in herself a response that she chose not to hurry past, the particular small pull of loss that you feel when something you value is about to change its shape. She did not say this. She said she thought it sounded like the right thing. He looked at her and said he thought so too. And they walked on. She had been thinking, for several weeks by then, about a project of her own, one that had been forming slowly in the back of her mind during all the months of the investigation, taking shape in the way that the most meaningful ideas tend to take shape, not from a moment of inspiration but from the gradual accumulation of what you have seen and learned and cannot look away from. What she had seen, in Marcus's story and in the stories of the others she had encountered through the investigation, was a pattern she recognized. People who had built real things had operated with genuine integrity and had been systematically undermined not by their own failures but by the calculated dishonesty of people who were skilled at appearing trustworthy. What she had also seen, because she had been inside the systems long enough to know how they functioned, was that the structures designed to protect against this kind of harm were generally better at processing it after the fact than at preventing it, and that the people most vulnerable to it were often the ones least connected to the legal and financial resources that would help them recognize and respond to it in time. She had never thought of herself as someone who built institutions for other people. She built institutions for return, which was a different thing, and she was good at it. But somewhere in the preceding months she had begun to think about the difference between the kind of value that could be measured in a spreadsheet and the kind that accumulated in a neighborhood when one person consistently showed up for the people around them, and about whether those two kinds of value were as separate as her professional life had always treated them. She had written a 12-page memorandum to herself about the structure of what she was imagining a foundation, funded initially through Mercer Capital, but designed to operate independently, focused on providing legal and financial literacy support to small business owners and entrepreneurs who were at risk of or recovering from predatory practices. It was not a perfect plan. It was a beginning. She told Marcus about it the week before he was set to leave for the Northern Project. They met at his apartment on a Tuesday evening, Lily asleep in her room down the hall, the apartment quiet and warm and smelling of the dinner he had made, and Diana laid out the idea in the same methodical way she laid out everything clearly, in order, with its gaps and uncertainties acknowledged rather than papered over. He listened without interrupting, his coffee cup in his hands, his expression attentive and unreadable, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her one question, the same question he asked about most things. Was it built to actually help people, or to appear to help them? It was a question she had asked herself, and she told him the honest answer, which was that she believed it was built for the former, and that she was aware of the ways it could become the latter if she was not careful. He nodded. He said he thought she would be careful. He said he would like to be involved, in whatever capacity was useful, not in a formal role, but as someone she could think things through with, someone who could tell her when the gap between the intention and the reality was beginning to open. She said that was exactly what she needed. He said then it sounded like they had something worth starting. They stood at the entrance of the building she had leased for the Foundation's first office, a low brick building in a neighborhood not entirely unlike Eastfield, with large windows and a wide front step and a wooden door that had been painted green by a previous tenant, and that she had decided to leave, as it was. It was a gray December morning, just cold enough for their breath to show, and Lily was there too, wearing a red wool hat with a pom-pom on top and holding a paper cup of hot chocolate with both hands. Supremely unbothered by the significance of anything that was happening, which was, Diana thought, exactly the right attitude. The street was quiet. No ceremony, no photographs, just the three of them standing at a door that was about to open for the first time. Diana had written the Foundation's mission statement herself, through several drafts, and had eventually reduced it to a single sentence that she had printed and framed, and leaned against the wall inside, waiting to be hung. To ensure that integrity does not become a luxury only some people can afford to keep. It was not poetry. It was a statement of intent, plain and direct, and it said what she meant. Marcus looked at the building, and then looked at Diana, and said that a year ago, when he had crossed the city twice to return a wallet to a stranger, he had not foreseen any of this. She said she had not either. He said that was probably how it was supposed to work, that the good things very rarely announced themselves in advance. Lily said she was cold, and could they please go inside now, because the hot chocolate was only warm anymore, and soon it would just be lukewarm chocolate. Diana put her key in the lock and turned it. The wallet was gone from the story by then. The way props always are when the play they set in motion has fully begun. $40,000 and a handful of documents, returned intact by a man who could have kept them without any consequence whatsoever, in a city that would never have known the difference, and would not have held it against him if he had. The city did not know his name. It did not know what he had lost or what he had kept. It only knew, the way cities know things through the small repeated fact of daily life, rather than through declaration, that there was a man in a neighborhood on the east side who showed up, who was honest, who could be counted on, and who cost nothing to trust. One decision, made not from calculation or strategy, or the anticipation of reward, but from the simple, stubborn conviction that things belonged where they belonged, and that you did not take what was not yours regardless of what it cost you not to. And from that one decision, made in the space of an ordinary Tuesday morning by an ordinary man in a faded flannel shirt, standing at a stranger's door with both hands extended, a record corrected, a fraud exposed, a neighborhood held with a little more care, a woman who had spent 20 years building things alone, beginning to understand what it meant to build something with someone, and a building with a green door opening for the first time to people who needed what it had to offer. Honesty does not always announce its returns. It does not always promise to come back around, or to bring anything with it when it does. But sometimes, in the long and unwitnessed turning of things, what you gave away in good faith comes back to you not as what you lost, not in the form you expected, not on the timeline you imagined, but as something more, something larger and stranger, and more lasting than you had any right to expect, when you were simply